So, as the abortion issue has been brought to the forefront of people's minds with the Roe versus Wade decision, I've been kind of ruminating on how I feel about it. My whole path on this started even when I was much younger. I always kind of leaned in the direction of, well, you shouldn't terminate a life that's inside you. But I would predicate this by making it very clear before we go any further that I do believe that the exceptions for rape and incest and a threat to the mother's life, that all of those things are totally reasonable exceptions that no matter what, somebody should be allowed to get an abortion for. Um, this graph here shows a difference between the laws in the United States as opposed to the European Union when it comes to abortion. And it's interesting to me specifically because the left right now has been pushing a lot in the direction of saying, well, we want the same social contract that they have in Europe. They're usually referring specifically to things like universal health care, universal college, childcare, maternity leave, etc. But on this issue, the European Union is actually considerably less in line with what the modern left would say in the United States. Because as you can see, the vast majority of the European countries, including the ones that, are essentially what they would call democratic socialist, the legal limit is between 11 to 20 weeks for abortion. So I sat and thought for a while about how I felt about it. I had always handled it in the past by just saying, well, I don't agree with abortion, so before I have sex with somebody, I'm going to make a decision to talk to that person about what we would do in the event that we got pregnant. And the reason I say we is because I believe that men should be responsible for any pregnancy that takes place. And as a consequence of that, and I have to say, and I'm not saying this to brag, but it's just to point out specifically, I had an extremely active sex life between the ages of 20 and 30 something. And as a result, we're talking about a lot of partners that I had this conversation with. And I still managed to have a very active sex life and still only had kids that I was trying to have. I mean, it's not impossible. And it's really going to come down to analyzing some of the best and worst arguments. And I think we're going to do a little bit of stick figure theater later. I drew up some stuff for that, but I also just kind of want to go over some of the weirder stuff that I saw on Facebook. So this post has been shared by people I know outside of activism, and I decided to go ahead and address it. Here's the thing, guys. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter when life begins. It doesn't matter whether a fetus is a human being or not. That entire argument is a red herring, a distraction, a subjective and unwinnable argument that could not matter less. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about a fertilized egg or a fetus or a baby or a 5-year-old or a Nobel Prize winning pediatric oncologist. Nobody has the right to use your body against your will, even to save their life or the life of another person. That's it. That's the argument. You cannot be forced to donate blood or marrow or organs, even though thousands die every year on waiting lists. They cannot even harvest your organs after your death without your explicit written pre-mortem permission. Denying women the right to abortion means we have less bodily autonomy than a corpse. The interesting thing about this, because this whole bodily autonomy thing is getting repeated pretty heavily on Twitter and on Facebook on this topic, is that it leaves out the fact that the baby didn't ask to be there. These analogies that they bring up for things like, well, they can't force you to donate your organs to someone else, somehow implies that that situation wasn't created by you. As if, somehow you didn't create the situation when you chose to have consensual sex and didn't want to take on the responsibility of what the possible consequences of that might be. I've since heard a pretty good argument about this, regarding, for example, a father and a son playing baseball out in the street and then accidentally breaking someone's window. If the person who you broke the window of says, well, I want you to pay for the window, and you say, well, I consented to play baseball. I did not consent to being responsible for your window. These kinds of arguments just don't make any sense. In addition to the fact that, again, they just kind of conjure up this image to cast the baby in this situation as if they're like some random person that just showed up and demanded that you give them their internal organs, as if you had no part in putting them in that situation. And that's just not the case. One of the things that's even more chilling about this is that it suggests it doesn't even matter if it's a 5-year-old. And this is when we start running into a situation where people just kind of say the quiet part out loud, that deep, deep down, some of these people really believe that it should be acceptable to kill your children. And this is not just a left leaning thing. I've met anarcho capitalists, for example, who follow Murray Rothbard, and that nutcase thinks that it should be acceptable to let your children starve. So don't think this is something unique, because Murray Rothbard is so absurdly anarchist libertarian that he even believes that you can't be made or compelled to take care of children that you brought into the world, and that the person's liberty is more important at that point than the welfare of the child. Considering I've been dealing with an awful lot of people saying that the Libertarian Party is just as bad as Republicans, this kind of stuck with me, but that's a topic for a different video. But again, this is not a situation where a baby exists and just showed up and said, hey, give me your organs. You brought the baby into the situation. The analogy that I typically use is that two people could decide to go and shoot their guns for recreational purposes. We'll say target shooting. But when you do that, you accept the fact that the purpose of a firearm is to project a projectile out of the front of it at a velocity that is significant enough that it could seriously kill a human being. You're taking that responsibility onto yourself. So throughout my life, I just kind of decided that if for some reason a woman that I was going to have intercourse with would handle the situation of being pregnant by getting an abortion, that to me is kind of like going shooting with somebody who feels that in the event that they accidentally hit someone due to their carelessness, that they would ask me to help them hide the body. I just don't agree with it. And as a consequence, I don't go shooting with people that are irresponsible, and I don't have sex with people that are irresponsible. Once again, bringing up the disclaimer that I do believe that people who are having a pregnancy as a result of incest or they're a victim of rape, it's a completely different situation. Okay. If the mother's life is in danger, completely different situation. But the thing is that those situations actually account for a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of the number of abortions that take place. So it's interesting that they say that we're focusing on the wrong thing, but now they're trying to suggest that because of the fact that there's this less than 2% of the population that gets abortions for those reasons, that we have to let 100% of the people do it. And it just doesn't square. They act like it's going to be a big problem to get the abortions for the people who are victims of rape. And they actually bring up a case that recently just happened, because all of this kind of happened pretty quickly, that a 10-year-old was not permitted to get an abortion of their parent's baby, or at least I'm assuming it's a parent, they didn't refer. And that's horrible, and obviously a 10-year-old should be allowed to get an abortion. That's not who this conversation is about. But regardless, what I would say about a lot of these other situations, having a baby would dramatically change my life, can't afford a baby right now, don't want to be a single mother or having relationship problems, or having completed their childbearing would be, well, then what are you having unprotected sex for in the first place? Why would you make that decision? If you were in a situation that you would not be able to handle being pregnant, then don't have unprotected sex. It's really that simple. And that's really where your choice in the situation is. You've made your choice. You chose to have sex for recreational purposes. What are the consequences of that? You chose to recklessly swing your gun around when we went shooting for recreation. You made that choice. It reminds me of a bumper sticker that I once saw that said, "I'm pro-choice before conception." Now, with all of that said, let's not forget that I also advocate for universal health care, child care, etc. So it's not like I'm a conservative who doesn't also grasp that we should be helping people take care of their kids. I also think that contraception, should be easy to get. I also think that one matter that's definitely an issue of bodily autonomy is that women should be allowed to choose when they want to be sterilized. Period. I obviously think an emphasis on reversible procedures is in order, because it's possible that the person may change their minds, which is actually the reason why many doctors refuse to do such procedures until they get to that point. But still, in addition to that, men should be looking at vasectomies because those are reversible as well. I agree to all of that. But those are all things that you should be doing with your bodily autonomy before you've brought a third party into the situation who didn't ask to be there, who's now dependent on you, not because they showed up and tried to take something from you, but because you put them in that situation. I started a series of conversations on Facebook about this, and it upset a lot of my longtime viewers. Well, remember who you're talking to, guys and gals. I've always told you that you're not always going to agree with everything I say, and I will also say that this is something that I haven't really completely formulated my thoughts on, which is part of the reasons I started those conversations. With that said, I do want to share one of the darker posts that came up in one of those conversations. In the animal world, there are often conditions that cause parents to abandon or kill their young. We are animals, and we have those conditions too. I agree with you that a fetus is a life, and I don't think we can afford to save all the fetuses that aren't wanted or viable to raise. Therefore, I'm pro-choice. And I go, because animals can kill their young. This is really the stance you are taking? To which she said, yes, it is. We are mammals. We also have a need to control the conditions under which we have young, like other mammals. To which I said, so, like hamsters, eating their young. Animals do a lot of other things as well, like, say, kill each other, and an awful lot of mating activity that is basically rape. So that okay as well? In other parts of the thread I pointed out, have you ever heard cats having consensual sex? No, you haven't, because they don't. There's actually all kinds of species where basically mating is rape. There are actually advanced baboons, like, not baboons, I don't think, I know gorillas for sure. Some of the more advanced primates literally engage in full-on genocide. If you move into their area, they kill everybody. They go to war and they kill everybody. And that includes brutally eating the children of the opposition. I don't think we should be using the animal kingdom when it comes to things like this as our moral compass. While this didn't come from a conversation that I started, it did come from a conversation I participated in. And this shows just how incredibly partisan and ridiculous the whole thing is. So this person says, the amount of vaguely creepy-looking white couples, because again, we're now just allowed to say white as a pejorative, holding up signs that say, don't abort, we will adopt your baby, while more than 400,000 children are languishing in foster care in the United States, tells you all you need to know about evangelical Americans. There's been a big, war on religion lately. So at this point, these are people who are willing to say, hey, we will take care of your baby. We will adopt your baby. And even they have to be demonized. They're suggesting apparently that everybody should just adopt a foster child. And if people can do that, I'm totally behind it. I have a friend who did that with two boys who are like the apple of her eye. And they came out, they came into her life, had a great life as a consequence. But adopting a foster child is not the same thing as adopting a baby. And not everybody is equipped to deal with that, which is what somebody in the next post is going to point out. But to give you an example, though, one of my ex-girlfriends from many years ago was point blank raped by the foster child in her home when she was about 15 years old. Because unfortunately, foster children can frequently come from very broken and difficult homes. They can have a lot of mental illness problems. They can have violence problems. It's not that simple. And somebody who's going to take a foster child into their home needs to recognize that. And it can't just be a situation that just anybody is qualified, to take part in. You really have to be somebody who's ready for what could happen. As a foster child growing up, I can say that not everyone can just adopt a foster child. Please remember that we are not like couples adopting babies. We have PTSD, depression, anger problems, and a lot of lack of self-worth, self-identity, self-confidence, and don't know how to express any emotion in a healthy way. Not everyone that wants to adopt should adopt a foster child. It takes a determined, extra loving, super stable couple with a fantastic support group of family and friends. It is a very trying thing to do, and only some people can do it. Don't bash people for only wanting to adopt babies. Babies are way more easy than a 6, 7, 8-year-old or a teenager who has had nothing but various forms of abuse shown them and given to them, their whole childhood thus far. Don't bash young couples wanting to adopt babies rather than from the system. And this is all very valid. And again, my heart goes out to people who can do this, but it's not something that just anybody can do. And shitting on people for saying that they want to adopt babies It's always about trying to find some way to demonize the other side of the argument, in any way that they can. It can't even be possible that somebody could come forward and say, well, I'll adopt your baby. We got to demonize them as well. It's just bullshit. Now, let's take a moment for some stick figure theater. This first slide I want to point out is an example, probably, of what both sides believe is true of the other when it comes to this. And I will acknowledge that there probably are some people, in fact, I know there are some people, who hold these incredibly extremist views. Whether it's the person who says, I want to be able to have sex without consequences, which basically is the type of person who just has abortions like birth control, who just doesn't care, just enjoys having sex too much to stop. Those people exist. They're real. And I would have to say, unfortunately, they're the ones who are going to draw the most attention to this conversation. On the other side of it, you do have the truly sexist patriarchs who think that women should not even be having sex unless they belong to a man. And these two people, I would say, do exist, but they constitute an extreme reality. And unfortunately, what happens is that if you're arguing this issue from the left or from the right, it doesn't take long before you just say one of these two things about the other person, or at least think it. So there is some truth to this, that these people do exist, but they do not in any way reflect a majority. Now let's get into some of the common positions and retorts that I see from people who are a little less extreme. I chose to have intercourse for recreation. I didn't want to have a child, and it's my body, my choice. Now, these people kind of represent the analogy that I gave earlier about playing baseball. You didn't consent to break a window. You consent to play baseball. But the purpose of playing baseball is that balls are going to be flying around, and as a consequence of that, windows may be broken. Just like the gun analogy that I used earlier, when you fire a gun, you're taking the responsibility for the fact that you may endanger someone else. So that's something that doesn't just go away because it's inconvenient to you. The other response would be, why did you have intercourse if you don't want a child? And what about the child's body? So the first part of this just has to go along with the idea that some people want full-on abstinence, and obviously I don't think that's realistic. However, there's plenty of ways to enjoy yourself sexually that do not involve unprotected intercourse, or intercourse at all. So there's that. What kind of responsibility, did you take to ensure that this didn't happen? That's pro-choice before conception again. What have you done to be sure that this wasn't an issue in the first place? And then what about the child's body? Because they say it's my body, my choice, but there's this other body in this situation that just doesn't exist in their minds. There's a lot of mental gymnastics that go into just pretending that there isn't another body in this situation. What typically happens next is, it's not a body, it's a clump of cells. You just want to control my body, my choice. To which the reply typically is, well, all living organisms are clumps of cells, and you just said that you chose to have intercourse. It's not a body, and even if it is, you can't force me to let it live inside me. That's bodily autonomy. To which the reply is, you chose to do something that led to another body being inside yours. What about their choice? All of this always tends to be predicated on whether or not somebody believes that there is a child inside them or not. And unfortunately, it's pretty clear that that pretty much depends on whether or not the mother wanted the baby or not. One of the conversations I started was to bring up the fact that there is a law that if you kill someone's unborn child when you assault them, that you are charged with fetal homicide. And you should be. If you beat up a pregnant woman and their baby dies, yeah, that's on you. You killed a living organism. But in the same society, for some reason, we have determined that it's okay for a woman to say, well, I don't want the baby, so therefore it's not alive. And that just doesn't make any sense. Now, that kind of leads to this next part, which I have to admit is not something that you can generally get them to publicly say out loud. But it's not a person unless I want them to be a person, which is a reflection of what I was just getting at. I think that a woman who is pregnant, who is trying to have a child, would want somebody charged with fetal homicide for harming their child. But that's basically what it amounts to is, did I want the child or not? That's what they want to be the issue of viability. If I happen to want to be a mother, then it's a child. If it's not, then it's not. If I don't, then it's not. Meanwhile, the other side will say, well, it's a person, whether you find them convenient or not. And those two exchanges, again, are two things that people are probably thinking to themselves that are not really going to say out loud. So the next part is, stop trying to control my body. You just hate women. Actually, I never said that. And for all I know, it is a female. Then it comes back to, you want to control my body. And then they say, no, I want to protect the one inside you. Because again, it's always about, well, you want to control my body. I imagine that there are some people, like I said, the caricature earlier of the extremist view, that a woman shouldn't be having sex unless she belongs to a man. I'm sure there are people that think like that. But most pro-lifers that I'm talking to, is in 99.999% of them, are not sitting up late at night thinking to themselves, I gotta go control that woman's body. Like as if they want to install puppet strings on all women and just walk them around or something, or use telepathy to dominate and control their bodies. It's just not true. So the suggestion somehow that that's what your objective is, when really what's going on, is that they don't want you to destroy the other body that is currently living inside yours. That, there's a straw man going on here that is just, it's something that has to be burned down. We come back to my body, my choice. They say, well, you chose to have intercourse. The top two here, I would say, really are what it all boils down to. If you can't resolve this conversation between yourself and another person, the rest of it just kind of falls on its face and is a waste of time. But if the woman says, this is not a life inside me, then you say, well, no, that is a life inside you. If you can't agree to that, then the rest of this becomes very difficult. But then they say, it's not alive, therefore I can terminate it. To which you would say, if it's not alive, then what is it that you are terminating? If there's no life in this situation, then what is it that you're terminating? Why do you have to do this if it's not alive? There are people who talk about, for example, if somebody were to have a condition where they were in a coma and you knew they were going to be in a coma for 8 months to 9 months, would you just pull the plug because you don't want to pay for it? Now, even worse, if you're the one who put that person in a coma for 9 months, would you just say, well, never mind, my body, my choice? Obviously not. And that's the real connection that you've got to hammer home. Your choice of action, if you had consensual sex, put that third party in that situation. If somebody was going to take 9 months to recover from something, you wouldn't just pull the plug on them. Well, this is a situation you created, and that's really what it's about, And when you say, if we find life on Mars and it's just microbes, is it still life? Because as somebody pointed out in one of these conversations I was having, they made an excellent point. We're currently right now desperately trying to see if we can find even just like tiny biological life forms on other planets. And if we do, the headline will definitely read, life discovered on Mars. But it's not a life apparently if nobody wants it, which is why I say the person says in reply, But then they default back to, stop trying to control women's bodies, sexist. And that's the part about it that I don't think that they're ever willing to square. They controlled their bodies to put themselves in the situation that they did, wherein a third party who did not ask to be there is now dependent on them. If you don't want anybody dependent on your body, don't put them there. Once again, going through the disclaimer, we're not talking about rape, we're not talking about incest, we're not talking about a situation where literally having the child will kill you. We're not talking about children that, will be deformed or will probably die, etc. There's a lot of other reasons that I've already stated it's different, that you can have an abortion in that situation. And I also want to remind everybody that my thoughts on this situation are still evolving over time. I'm still considering lots of viewpoints. But these are the kinds of things that I just see play out over and over and over again. And I just don't like the mental gymnastics that we're going through. I am an agnostic leaning towards atheist. I'm not religious, but I believe that, and atheists say this all the time, that we don't need religion to have morality. Well, if we can just decide, like if we're flipping a switch on when life is important and when it's not, That's a pretty dark dystopian situation to find yourself in. And that's not a society I'd want to live in. But there have been people throughout history who've decided that they can determine when life is or is not important. And those people usually turn out to be pretty evil. So that's one of the reasons I brought this up. Like I said, there are extremes. Most pro life people and most pro choice people that I meet do not hold extremist views. But you're getting to see some pretty dark stuff, like people are hamsters that should be allowed to eat their young. Now, this is the final thing I'm going to share with you guys, and it comes from a Facebook conversation on my private, like actual non activist wall. And I'm noticing again a trend that we are just really dehumanizing each other over everything now. Like this is why people are concerned about a civil war, because we've reached a point that we can't even communicate with each other. And if I don't agree with you about something, it's no longer, well, we don't hold the same views about this philosophically. Now it's you're an evil person and you shouldn't even be allowed to live. Well, this person doesn't go quite that far. You can see how many steps we are away from that. Here's the deal. I don't think you entirely understand the implications of the thread you've pulled. We don't just disagree on whether a fetus is a person, we disagree on the fundamental nature and definition of murder. People that I know and love are, by your definition, murderers at worst, easily capable of negligent homicide at best. That's very important. You have argued very hard to convince me that you believe this with all of your heart. Under the old circumstances, we could treat it as a thought experiment or a difference of opinion and agree to disagree. With the way the law is now, that is no longer the case. You and your fervently held beliefs are now a legitimate hazard to people that I know and love. Why? Because if I genuinely believed you had murdered someone without good reason, I would turn you into the authorities in a second. Wouldn't even have to think about it. People who murder without what I see as a good reason are sociopaths who might murder anyone it suits them to, and hence cannot be trusted in open society. And there is no statute of limitations on murder. You and your beliefs have declared themselves a legitimate hazard to those that I know and love. You aren't concerned about almost half a century of legal precedent collapsing and causing chaos. You aren't concerned about people that I know and love. You're concerned about potential people more than those that are already here, to the degree that you're okay with those people being declared and treated as murderers. We can't agree to disagree on that. It's like he's implying that, like he says, well, there's no statute of limitations. Like we're just going to go find all of the previous abortion doctors and, execute them for murder, or that, when he talks about almost half a century of legal precedent, as if we didn't have, centuries of legal precedent that came before that, and if we're going to talk about things that had long legal precedent, well, slavery had an awful lot of legal precedent and we got rid of that. There are plenty of other examples of things just like that. Something being legal for 50 years doesn't just suddenly mean that, therefore it's set and we never change it, and I'm sure that there are plenty of other things, that he would never be okay with. I mean, I pointed out, for example, to him, I said, well, you obviously need universal health care, and there are plenty of people that are going to argue that that's not in the Constitution, and therefore there's hundreds of years of legal precedent to say that health care is not a human right. This is kind of the problem that we're at, is that, that we're dealing with, is that people now are so partisan that, again, it's like, now you're a hazard. Like he thinks I'm going to show up and like shoot people in his house who've had abortions or something. Like, it's, you're harmful. This is a safe space and now you're a threat, or you're going to do damage to people I know. Anyway, he says, you've dug your heels in and you're going to have to deal with the hole you end up in because of it. I've given you chance after chance to prove that you have some sort of bend, but you don't. You do not seem capable anymore of being moderate or reasonable to any degree, and that unfortunately means I might need to cut contact with you to some degree to protect people that I love. Protect them from what? Again, this is something this person believes so heavily, and I've literally known them for double digits, like multiple decades of years. We've been really good friends. And this is not the same person who told me that the Border Patrol was going to help Trump take over the government. That was another person who was like completely, partisanized by social media, that, based, basically social media reactions based in emotion and not logic and reason. But I didn't say any of these things. I didn't say that every person who's had an abortion should be strung up on, brought up on murder charges. These are all a bunch of things that they've invented in their head. But it comes back down to, you are a hazard to people I love. Like as if I'm going to hurt them. And the reality is like, because one of the other things he had said earlier in the conversation was to say that my thoughts on the issue were irrelevant. My thoughts on the issue are just as relevant as any other voting person in the populace. And I think that's really the problem. They were all about this, like you said, in the previous situation, we could just agree to disagree about this because at that point, they feel that they were winning. And now that they feel that they're losing, now all of a sudden it's war. It really kind of feels like that. Like people think that we're going to have to fight a civil war over this for the same reasons we fought one over slavery. And yes, I know that it wasn't actually about slavery. It was about states' rights. But it's a similar feeling. People think that we're going to have to fight a war over this. This is what's left. If you get to the point that you need to stop talking to anybody who doesn't agree with you, then what is left? In addition to the fact that, as I've demonstrated already, for example, and I'm going to bring it up again ad nauseum, Rolling Stone published an article to say that the Buffalo shooter was a mainstream Republican. I read stuff every single day where there's a huge effort to try to demonize and dehumanize all Republicans. And to those of you who are on the right, don't claim that you're not doing this to the commies. You are. It's getting to a point where you're left with nothing. We have no ability to communicate. We're not allowed to disagree. If you disagree on this concept philosophically with me, then it means that you hate me and you want to kill me and you want to kill everybody that I know. That's the direction that we're headed. And this only keeps getting worse. And that's why, that's the thing, this is a new thing, because again, both of these friends that I'm talking about were both people that I used to be able to have good, logical, reasonable disagreements with, but that's no longer possible. And they're being riddled nonstop, with the attitude that, that the right is evil. And I have friends on the right, and I have to say it's less of a problem on the right because the people that I interact with on the right, like many of you, for example, know full well, that I support the kind of government they have in Denmark, but you didn't stop talking to me. And we can have good conversations where we disagree with each other. It happens in Discord all the time. Yet what is different is this. I can disagree with people on the right and still hang out with them and still be their friends. When it comes to situations like this, if I disagree with somebody who's leaning left, well, now I'm hazardous. Now I'm harmful. Now I'm dangerous. Now I'm not safe. Where does that head to next? We got to get rid of all those people who don't agree with us. That's what's left at the end of that. So before we go, I'm going to play this little video, John Cleese versus extremism. And I've recommended this to a lot of people because I suspect, unfortunately, that this problem that John Cleese had diagnosed, I think this video was back from the early 80s, is actually only getting worse. And social media in particular makes it worse because it allows you to participate in extremism from the safety of your keyboard. And he goes into what's really going on in the minds of a lot of these people. So let's take a look.
Seriously, though, we've heard a lot about extremism recently, a nastier, harsher atmosphere everywhere, more abuse and bother boy behavior, less friendliness and tolerance and respect for opponents. All right, but what we never hear about extremism is its advantages. Well, the biggest advantage of extremism is that it makes you feel good because it provides you with enemies. Let me explain. The great thing about having enemies is that you can pretend that all the badness in the whole world is in your enemies and all the goodness in the whole world is in you. Attractive, isn't it? So, if you have a lot of anger and resentment in you anyway, and you therefore enjoy abusing people, then you can pretend that you're only doing it because these enemies of yours are such very bad persons. And that if it wasn't for them, you'd actually be good-natured and courteous and rational all the time. So, if you want to feel good, become an extremist. Okay, now you have a choice. If you join the hard left, they'll give you their list of authorized enemies. Almost all kinds of authority, especially the police, the city, Americans, judges, multinational corporations, public schools, furriers, newspaper owners, fox hunters, generals, class traitors, and, of course, moderates. Or, if you'd rather be an extremist on the hard right, no problem, fine, you still get a lovely list of enemies, only they're different ones. Noisy minority groups, unions, Russia, weirdos, demonstrators, welfare sponges, meddlesome clergy, peaceniks, the BBC, strikers, social workers, communists, and, of course, moderates. And upstart actors. Now, once you're armed with one of these super lists of enemies. You can be as nasty as you like and yet feel your behaviors morally justified. So you can strut around abusing people and telling them you could eat them for breakfast and still think of yourself as a champion of the truth, a fighter for the greater good, and not the rather sad paranoid schizoid that you really are.
Now, what's particularly important about that clip is that he also pointed out that you can't be moderate. If you're a moderate, then you're the enemy of both of the extremist sides. You can only say exactly what that person says with no deviation whatsoever, or you are the enemy. And it also points out that having enemies makes you feel good. So you see people that are having problems in their real life, maybe they're angsty or angry about something, or maybe they've just succumbed to rage addiction. They've basically kind of gotten to the point where I feel so good from being an asshole to people that I don't like that I'm going to go do a good thing today and log on to Twitter and find as many people that I think are as despicable as possible to shit on. And it's really important, guys, that you watch for this. Do not become rage addicted, because that's how you end up in situations like where it's completely not even necessary for what you're being, for what you're angry about to be rational. It's not, because what's more important is that you get your fix. You get your rage addiction fix. And you cannot allow these kinds of things to make it impossible for you to think clearly. That's how you end up with situations like saying that somebody bringing up legitimate science about trans athletes in sports is hate speech. You need it to be hate speech, even if it's absolutely true. So, in any case, thanks for tuning in, guys. Like and subscribe and ring the bell. I am looking for more patrons on Patreon, particularly now because, unfortunately, since Ray Powell has passed away, half of my Patreon money is now gone. I miss you, Ray. You were awesome. And thank you to everybody who's been supporting me so far. I'm actually supposed to be on a long panel coming on Friday at 6 p.m. And I should be doing my normal weekly stream at some point this week. Thanks again for tuning in, guys.